Hello, welcome to Amber Book's 40 Minutes of Competence. I'm glad you're here. Today we're going to be talking about the standard of care and kind of other contractual things. In this example, it's actually based on a real court case from Northern Virginia from, well, I think the event happened in 2006. The court ruled in 2011, and then the Supreme Court, I think, ruled in 2016. So it's a long process indeed. But the architect hired a civil engineer to design the church in a parking lot, and the parking lot was required to address stormwater runoff. So the engineer selected an off-the-shelf under-pavement tank to hold the runoff and slowly release the rainwater back to the ground. And the engineer is going to go ahead and rely on the manufacturer's literature, which was not written by an engineer, though the civil engineer didn't know that at the time, and use that to write the prescriptive specs for the buried tank. And then the contractor, who bid on the project, and by doing so agreed to build it both perfectly and build it just as it was drawn in the contract documents, expressed concern that the tank would not perform properly because it sat below the water table, the level that the water's at. And the contractor submitted an RFI, which is of course a request for information that a contractor will submit to an architect saying, I'm not sure about this. Can you confirm that this is what you want? And through the architect, it went to the civil engineer, and the civil engineer basically said, yeah, it's fine. Don't worry about it. Install it as it was drawn. And then so the tank was installed as drawn because that's what the contractor was told to do. And then it caused a parking lot collapse, and that delayed the church's opening by 16 months. So the question is, who's at fault? Is it the manufacturer because the tank was not adequate? Is it the architect because the drawings weren't adequate? Is it the civil engineer because her drawings weren't adequate? Was it the owner because the Spearing Doctrine holds that the contractors are responsible for faulty drawings? Or was it the contractor because he warranties that his work won't collapse? The answer in this case is the civil engineer is actually the one who was found liable. But of course, I wouldn't feel bad if you didn't get that right. This is a tough case. That's why it took 10 years in the courts. And that's why the parties involved and even their insurance companies who deal with this all the time couldn't agree who was really at fault. And I like this problem. I like this particular case because it involves so many things that are important to this exam. It involves stormwater runoff. It involves types of specifications and bidding and contractors' warranties and the RFI chain, the Spearing Doctrine, which someone asked about the other day, inexperienced clients, risk, the standard of care, change order, liability insurance, and how that relates to the standard of care, and the insurance reimbursement chain. So let's go through these one by one. The stormwater runoff. So basically, if you have surface that's impermeable, water is going to run downhill, and you don't want. We used to just the motto used to be like, get it off the site, into the street, into the drain as quickly as possible. We don't want it to flood or cause problems in our site. But of course, that led to all kinds of erosion, and it led to changes in the ecosystem in the local streams because the local streams were having all the water at once, especially in built-up areas that had a lot of pavement. I think LA County is like, I don't know, 40% paved or something like that. So we don't want all that water at once going and causing floods and eroding our streams and making the water cloudy so that it messes with the ecosystem. So what we're going to do is beginning at least 30, 40 years ago, but in earnest, really, it started to become really urgent, I would say 15 years ago. Municipalities all over the country started really cracking down and saying, look, if you have a big parking lot, a big paved area that doesn't allow water to slowly recharge and just kind of seep through the soil and work its way slowly to recharge the underground aquifer and gradually move off the grass and maybe move into a stream. If you don't have that kind of system because you paved everything, you need to hold water runoff on the site and then let it out slowly. If you're going to let it out at all, either it's going to seep through the earth slowly or you're going to kind of drip it into the stream slowly. And so that's what this is. So this is an underground tank. It's actually not a like off the shelf underground tank that came in a truck. It's just a bunch of pipes, and you can see it's just a bunch of pipes. And so the water will go into the into the drain, into the catch basin, and then it's going to go and fill this up. So if there's a big rain like we're having here, because right now as I record this, we're having 1.5 inches of rain today for a leftover of Hurricane Betsy. So on a day like today, where we're having 1.5 inches of rain over a large parking lot, a lot of water is going to come. And that water is going to be held by this tank, and then it's going to drip, drip, drip somewhere, gradually over the next, I don't know if it's the next 2 days or the next 20 hours or the next 2 weeks, I'm not quite sure, but it's going to kind of gradually drip, drip, drip out. And if one of you guys knows about how long these things usually take to empty, you can write me and let me know. But anyhow, and this is what it looked like a week or two later. Actually, probably, yeah, like a week later, I went back and took photos. So they'd covered it up, and it's going to become a parking lot. And the water, once they pave it, the water will go and fill up that tank. And that's the kind of thing we're talking about. So that's stormwater runoff. We want the water to go slowly. Now, there are different types of specifications. There are performance-based specs. There are prescriptive specs, open proprietary, closed proprietary, and reference. So in a performance-based spec, we're talking about something like, well, in the case of the tank, the performance spec may say, install a tank of at least, install a tank of 100,000 gallons. It is to be able to withstand a point load of 2,000 pounds per square foot. It is to have this much nickel in it so that it doesn't rust, or whatever. It'll have the kind of it'll explain the performance that's required for this particular tank. In the case of a prescriptive spec, we're talking about something that says that that's really specific to the construction means and methods. So in this case, it may say, it said bury the tank 10 feet below the 10 feet below the parking lot. So if in section, here's the parking lot, the tank was to be buried 10 feet below it. And so that was the problem, because when you dug, say, say 4 feet below it or something, there was water table. So we're trying to bury a tank that's empty in water, in soil that's full of water for just about all the time. So that essentially means that the tank always wants to float, and that's what happened. It floated up and caused a big old buckle, or lots of buckles in the parking lot, and delayed the opening of the church by 16 months. So so it was a prescriptive, at least partially prescriptive spec that told the contractor how deep to bury it. Now, as you might imagine from your own experience, lots of specs have more than one of these. So you could have a performance spec that talks about how much nickel the tank has to have, that also has a prescriptive point measure, in it, that says it has to be buried 10 feet deep or something. So it's not like if it's one type of spec, it can't be another type. Proprietary specs say it has to be, Acme brand tank. An open proprietary type, this type here, says it has to be an Acme brand or equivalent. So it's up to the contractor to say, we found a better one or a less expensive one. We think we're going to replace it. And then they would typically ask the architect for permission, say, we're going to swap this out. And the architect would probably take too long to say yes. A closed proprietary spec means that it's going to be Acme tank or nothing. Like, you cannot replace it. Of course you can. I mean, if they run out of that model number, the contractor will say, okay, let's do a change order. And get everyone to kind of agree that we're going to do a new tank. And a change order is essentially something in writing that is signed, and very importantly for this exam, is signed by the architect, the owner, and the contractor, and says we're going to change the contract documents. So the contract documents say you have to bury a Acme tank, but they no longer make that, and so or there's we realize the water table's there, and there's a different tank that you need to use, different model number we need to use when the water table is as high as it is here. So we're going to replace it with another one. So that would be a change order. And then there are reference specs. And reference specs, there are these organizations like ASTM, you've probably heard of, the American Society of Testing Materials, ISO, International Standards Organization, and they'll have a number after it. So ASTM 55 or ISO 9001 or whatever. So there is probably, if you were to do a search, there's probably some kind of a reference that was developed by civil engineers for how a tank is to be buried. So it says, you know, it shall be buried with at least, I don't know if I'm making this up, but 4 inches of gravel beneath it. It shall be covered at a depth of no less than 4 feet. It shall, you know, that kind of thing for tanks. And so you could have a spec that just says, you need to meet this particular reference, or you could have a spec that combines some of these together. Anyhow, so then there's bidding. Well, I guess this didn't talk too much about bidding, but the way this works usually with a design bid build, and that's the default for the ARE 5.0. And the idea is that the church hired an architect in design bid build. The architect signed a contract with the owner, that's the church, and the architect said, okay, I'm going to make some drawings for you. I'm going to do this to the standard of care that was in the drawings, in the contract, more of this in the bid. Then the architect helps the owner, shepherds the owner through the process of putting the contract out to bid. So the owner, they're going to put it out to bid, and people are going to, different contractors are going to submit sealed bids. Someone will say, I'll do it for 4 million. Someone will say, I'll do it for 3.8 million. And then it's up to the owner who gets to decide which contractor she's going to go with. Now, she can pick one based on the lowest bid. That's what's often more or less required in public projects. Generally, it's the lowest responsible and responsive bidder. Responsible meaning they have the financial wherewithal and the past experience building things like this that they can legitimately pull off doing it, building the church. And number two, that they're responsive, and that means that they did, it looks like they accounted for everything in the drawings. They didn't kind of accidentally seem to omit the outdoor lighting. That, you know, if everyone in the kind of schedule of values, or maybe not schedule of values, but if everyone kind of seemed to have accounted for the outdoor lighting for the parking lot, but one bidder did not account for that, that would be a red flag for the owner, and they say, I don't think they accounted for this, and that owner may follow up. So the owner has actually a great deal of discretion in choosing which contractor they're going to go with. And they may say, I want to go with a third lowest bid because that particular contractor is barely more expensive than the lowest or second lowest bid. And that particular contractor does a really good job. I've worked with him before, and I trust him to do a great job. So just like any other kind of shopping experience, it's up to the consumer, in this case, the owner, to make a decision as to what he's going to do. And he doesn't have to really, as far as I know, explain why, unless it's a public project like a school or a firehouse that the municipal or federal or state level government is paying for, in which case there are typically really complex rules to make sure that I as a local magistrate don't give the courthouse project to my brother-in-law. So anyhow, but importantly in the bidding, the contractor agrees two things. One is to build the building exactly as it's drawn. And the other is the contractor warranties that the building is going to be pretty much perfect. So it has to be exactly as drawn and perfect. And I'm going to skip over RFI chain for a second and talk a little bit about the Spearman doctrine, because if that occurred to you that you have exactly as drawn and perfect as a Venn diagram are not always exactly the right thing. It could be that it's drawn incorrectly. So what is a poor contractor to do? You kind of feel for them. They have to warranty that it's perfect, but they also have to make it exactly as it's drawn. And so what happens if it's drawn imperfectly? And the Spearman doctrine is based on a 100-year-old Supreme Court case, the US versus Spearman, that basically said that if the contractor builds it as drawn and the drawings are insufficient, then it is not the contractor's fault. It doesn't say it's the drawer's fault. It doesn't say it's the architect or civil engineer's fault. It just says it's not the contractor's fault. And usually then it's going to fall on the owner. So in these edge cases, it's often going to fall on the owner That's why they get the big bucks when things work out, because they take the risk, a lot of the risk the rest of the time. The RFI chain. So what happens is the architect has a contract with the owner. The contractor has a contract with the owner. The architect and contractor don't have contracts with each other, and the owners don't have contracts with the subs. So the architects will have contracts with different subcontractors, and the contractor will have some subcontracts with different subcontractors, and the contractor presumably hired someone, hired an excavation company or something, excavation company to excavation company to dig out the tank, and the architect definitely hired a civil engineer, because that's who was found liable. And what will happen is an RFI is a request for information. So if the contractor is stumped because he dug down and he saw that there's a giant pit of water all the time, and now he has to bury a tank in that pit of water, and so he was like, well, what am I supposed to do? So he submitted, the excavator here, excavation sub, submitted an RFI, but does the excavation sub just go to the owner and say, I need some more information about this. Do you really want me to bury it this deep? No, it's very important that not happen in real life, but also especially in this exam. Does the excavation person go right to the civil engineer and say, what the heck do you mean by you want it to be 10 feet under? Do you know that the water table, did you look at the soil boring test? The water table here is only 4 feet down. You can't bury a tank that's going to float. No, the excavation subcontractor does not do that. In order to preserve both a good chain of documentation, chain of liability, but mostly because the architect, contractor, and owner are expected to know everything, and the excavation contractor and civil engineer are not expected to know everything. And by everything, I mean like the makeup of the soil. Well, I guess they would all know the makeup of the soil. That's a bad example, but they know that the parking lot, if the architect is going to change the parking lot to a gravel parking lot, with consultation with the owner and the contractor, you wouldn't want the excavation person talking to the civil engineer, because the excavation person doesn't know that the parking lot has been changed from the asphalt parking lot to a gravel parking lot, which is obviously going to have a significant impact in water runoff. So to preserve kind of a chain of command of chain of information, the excavation subcontractor is going to submit the RFI to the contractor, and then the contractor will share the RFI with the architect and the owner, and then the architect will share the RFI with the civil engineer. Then the civil engineer will respond to the RFI to the architect, and the architect will share it with the contractor and the owner, and then the contractor will share it with the excavation subcontractor. And so kind of preserving that chain of information turns out to be pretty important. All right. So that's the RFI chain, Spear Doctrine. Inexperienced clients. So I don't know this for sure. This case is based on it's the W.H. Gordon Associates versus Heritage Fellowship, United Church of Christ. So it was built in 2006, and the Supreme Court didn't finally rule on it till 2016. So I can't imagine that if the architect and the owner and the contractor and the civil engineer knew they were going to have to hire lawyers and go to court for 10 years, I can't imagine that they wouldn't have come up with some kind of a resolution beforehand. But inexperienced clients, and in my experience, that includes residential in general, condos in particular, and houses of worship as well, because there's always in each of those, in the case of a condo or a house of worship, there's always or in the case of a condo, there's always a lawyer and a contractor on the building committee. I mean, on the condo board. They just happen to live there. It seems like it always works out that way. And so they're like, I know a lot about this. I could have done this better. I have experience in litigation. Things are slow right now. Let's sue. Or they just know that it was poorly done. I mean, I don't want to always say that the condo board is wrong. They may, sometimes things are just done wrong. But they already have an entity ready to sue. Whereas a bunch of apartment dwellers who don't have a condo board, because they each just pay a landlord, every month, they might not have the wherewithal to kind of organize and sue in the same way that a condo board would. In the case of a house of worship, they often have a building committee, and again, the building committee almost always has an ex-contractor, in my experience. And you can share with me on the chat if you've had that experience too. But there's almost always a contractor on the building committee, and often it's someone who's really bright and knows a lot, and sometimes it's someone who's very litigious. But anyhow, so you have, when you have emotions kind of getting in the way, and it's not your money, it's the church's money hiring the lawyer, or the condo board's money hiring the lawyer, maybe you might think differently than if it's your own money. In the case of residential generally, single family or otherwise, there's often a lot of emotion tied up in someone's house. They really don't want noise upstairs, and they really don't want any mold in the basement. I mean, no one does, but they really don't. And in the case of, on the opposite extreme, on the case of, say, a university who hires builders all the time, well, they work with the same builders all the time, and they have a relationship with them, and the builders want to do right by the clients, and the clients want to do right by the builders, and just everyone knows that they're going to have to work with each other again, and everyone knows that bad things happen in these situations, and everyone knows that it may be 10 years to settle it. So if there was a situation like this, and it wasn't a church, let's say it was an experienced developer with, millions of square feet under roof, and an experienced builder with millions of square feet under roof that had worked a lot with that particular developer, I think it's quite likely, I suspect it's quite likely, that at some point they would have sat down and they would have said, okay, we all kind of messed up a little. We all have a little risk in, we all have a little risk in this. Let's work this out. Let's do a change order. We're going to delay construction. The change order is going to be it's going to be a document there's an AIA, document for change orders, and they're going to fill that out, and they're going to say, okay, the architect's insurance company or the architect will pay the contractor this, or the owner will pay the contractor that, or the architect will pay for it in free services, or the civil engineer will waive her fee, or whatever. We're gonna work out something where the civil engineer maybe gives a little money to the owner gives a little money to the contractor, and anytime money changes, the design changes, or the schedule changes, you need a change order, and that change order is going to be generated by the architect, typically, always, and well, almost always. In reality, it's not always, but in NCARB world, it's always, unless it's the design build entity, which is the architect and contractor is one entity. But the architect is going to generate a change order that says that the civil engineer will pay the owner this, and the owner will pay the contractor this, and the excavation person will be paid a little bit by the contractor, or by the owner who pays the contractor, usually, because everything is kind of done kind of through the chain of command. So probably the civil engineer would pay the architect would pay the owner, and so forth. Because the owner doesn't want to get involved in every dispute between every sub, because there may be 100 subs on a job, and the owner can't be dealing with that. So that's what the architect and contractor are for. So, but there was no change order. But had there been one, it's very important that the architect, it's in writing, and that change order essentially changes the contract. And the change order has to be signed by the architect, by the contractor, and by the owner. That's very important in this exam as well. All right, now risk. So we have kind of risk, and we have the owner, and the owner takes some risk, a lot of risk actually. The owner kind of takes whatever's left, because if the project doesn't work out, the owner is the one that is going to have to probably try to get their money, from someone's insurance company. And the architect takes some risk, and the contractor takes some risk. Now, in reality, the architect doesn't take as much risk as the contractor, not even close, I think, because the standard agreements were created by the AIA, and the AIA, I think, kind of hooked up the architects and said, look, the architects have to meet the following standard, and it's called the standard of care. So what the architect has to do is, the architect is not to warranty his work. The architect is not to guarantee his work. The architect is not to act as a fiduciary, which means act in the owner's best interest, technically. The architect, according to the contract, merely has to meet the standard of care. And the standard of care, this kind of very important phrase in construction law as it relates to architecture contracts, the standard of care says that the architect is going to give a quality of service comparable to that you would find in other architects in that locality at that time. So basically, it's a race to the bottom, right? You don't have to be great. You don't have to be great. You don't have to prove that you worked in the best interest of the owner, even though of course you should. But according to the contract, you only have to be mediocre. You have to do the kind of types of level of service that other people would get. And if you think it would be hard to prove that an architect didn't meet that level for an owner, if an owner felt an architect didn't do well, if you think that standard of care clause would make it difficult for an owner to get an architect to hold an architect liable, you would be absolutely correct. It is very difficult because of the way the standard contract is written. It is very difficult for an owner to beat an architect in court, because the architect just has to find someone who says, yeah, I practiced there at that time, and it's pretty normal to specify or to just hand off the specification of a tank to your civil engineer and do what they do. And that's all that this architect did. So this architect really met his obligation to the owner. Wasn't always this way, but it has been this way for a long time. So the architect only has to meet the standard of care, which is a low bar indeed. The contractor actually has to meet a pretty high standard. The contractor has to, as I mentioned, do exactly what the architect drew, exactly what the contract documents are, and has to warranty everything, typically for a year, sometimes for 10 years, or sometimes for the life of the warranty of the product. But anyhow, the contractor has to make sure that everything is perfect. And so the owner actually has a pretty easy case against the contractor and a pretty tough case against the architect. Now, in reality, the architect really, because of the standard of care, doesn't take on that much risk. The contractor takes on more risk, but the owner still has to prove that the contractor did something wrong. And so in practice, if it does go to court, judges and juries don't have expertise in this stuff. They don't know what the water table is, and they might not even know that tanks have to float, and they might not understand that water runoff is a big deal. And if they do, they might not understand what the standard of care is, and that contractors are agreeing, what contractors are agreeing to. And so what winds up happening is whoever has the best expert witness wins. So this is why, if you ever are given an opportunity to become an expert witness, don't take that job unless you want to get rich, because there's a lot of money to be made if you're a good expert witness who doesn't tend to lose, because better expert witnesses, they're just expert witnesses that tend to convince juries and judges a lot better than others. So you could imagine a scenario where this church parking lot, you can imagine in another world, if there were different expert witnesses, the courts might have found that the contractor was at fault, or might have found that the architect was at fault, or might have found that no one was at fault, and it's just kind of one of those things, and the owner, it's up to the owner. So this is the situation we're in. All right, now change order we covered, liability insurance and the standard of care. So I started this process of teaching this stuff thinking that it was a little questionable and concerning, and maybe I was a little conspiratorial, but I felt like NCARB was writing the exam basically to say you should always meet the standard of care, and you should always use basically all of the things that are in the standard AIA document, because the AIA sells the AIA document. The AIA agreements are sold by the AIA. The contracts are written by the AIA. So it seemed a little suspicious that pretty much everything in this exam that has to do with law is based on the AIA contracts, and kind of hints towards using the AIA contract. So I was very skeptical of that, and have been probably for a few years, but more and more, I am totally on board. I don't think I would ever do a project. I would not ever do a project without using the AIA agreement. And even though, you know, that 50%, at least that's what the local insurance guy said here. I don't know if he was talking about nationally or here locally, but 50% of all architecture jobs, there's no contract. Not only is there not the AIA contract, there's no contract. Because frankly, the owners don't want to sign the AIA contract because it really makes the architect kind of untouchable. So the reason I would use the AIA contract is because as I keep reading about these things, a couple things are clear. One is that over the years, the AIA contract has come to recognize all kinds of problems and resolve them when they come up a lot. So every 10 years, there's a new set of contracts, and the new set of contracts will kind of resolve all the problems that have crept up in the old set of contracts. So what happens if it's BIM and the drawings are now digital, or what happens if you guaranteed LEED certification, but you didn't get it? And these are things that creep up in lawsuits, and it happens enough times that the AIA will actually incorporate it. So it's kind of an evolution. It's a growing, living, breathing document that keeps getting better and better. And there's no way that you as an individual have that kind of institutional knowledge to make, even with a good lawyer, to make your own version of it. And there's no way you can account for all the things that the AIA document has accounted for. Number two, there is a long history of case law that explains what happens. So the next time there's a floating tank, the civil engineer is going to know that she's liable. And so because, you know, or at least know that it's likely, because the next person is going to be able to point to this court case. So because of when there's kind of standard contracts, there is an established chain of case law that people can point to. And so things are more predictable, because you don't want to lose the case, but you really don't want to lose the case after 10 years. That's much worse than just losing the case while they try to figure it all out. But most importantly, by far most importantly, is that your insurance may not cover you if you don't use the AIA contract. So if you, for instance, use the contract that you hashed out with the owner on your own, and then something goes wrong, and now, you know, you're being sued for, you know, someone got killed because there was a fire, and you're being sued for way more money than you'll ever come up with. You're going to have to close your firm, and you may be in really big trouble, because your insurance company is going to say, wait a minute, you guaranteed as an architect, you didn't say you'd meet the standard of care, you guaranteed perfection, basically, the same way a contractor would, that you guarantee that your drawings would be error-free. We can't support you in that. And so, so just for that reason alone, if you're going to be paying money to your insurer every month, it would be nice to know that the insurer is actually going to cover you when there's a claim. And that kind of peace of mind really won't come unless you're using the standard document. Because if you hash out your own agreement, you hash out your own contract, that's a big problem, man. Because if a developer sits down across the table from an architect to negotiate something, who's going to win that negotiation? Obviously the developer will, because they do this for sport. They're dealing with risk management and fine print and dollars and spreadsheets all day long. And the architect probably is not dealing with those all day long. And so the developer will eat the architect for lunch and just do it for fun. So that's why I now am a big believer in the AIA documents. So consider me another convert. Now, when the liability insurance, so what happens is the civil engineer lost the case, but almost certainly the civil engineer did not have to open her wallet. What happened is the civil engineer's insurance company is going to have to pay. Now, does the insurance company pay the owner? No. Most likely, the owner is actually going to essentially be suing the architect, because the owner has a contract with the architect. So the owner didn't really sue the civil engineer. The owner sued the architect and brought this and included the civil engineer as a witness. The architect's insurance then goes after the civil engineer's insurance. And then the civil engineer's insurance pays the architect's insurance. And the architect's insurance pays the owner. So the owner gets his money, but the owner gets his money from the civil engineer to the architect, and from the civil engineer's insurance company to the insurance company of the architect. And then the insurance company of the architect is going to pay the owner from the money that the civil engineer's insurance company paid. So it's the insurance companies in the end, if everything's kept to the contract and everything's kind of normal and vanilla, in the end, it's going to be the insurance companies who hash this all out anyway. So your liability insurance pretty much requires, or at least won't necessarily cover you if you promise something more than the standard of care. And a savvy owner will try to get you to promise that. And then the insurance reimbursement chain is what we just discussed. So that is the story, the kind of long, convoluted story of this particular buried tank that includes all of these concepts that are pretty important in the exam. All right, for next class, for next week, and we meet, of course, every Sunday at 6 p.m. Eastern. And if you want to get the Zoom link, you can write to firms@amber-book.com if you're not already on the list. And so for this, I want you to, this is an apartment here, and this is a hallway, interior hallway. And so I want you to identify the acoustical concerns associated with this apartment and answer how would you address those concerns. So that's for next week. And then I'll review some of the questions that came up in the chat last week. How long does it take to go over the Amber book material? And then a participant said, it took me about a month and a half, but it depends on your pace. I was taking about a minimum of 3 to 4 hours a day on weekdays and weekends more intensively. That sounds about right. So you can certainly do it in a month. Most people historically have done it in about 2 months. Lately, it's been a little longer because we are adding content all the time and improving content all the time. So lately, it's maybe been 2.5 months or something on average. I have always been confident that the Amber book is good enough for all 6 exams. I am now extraordinarily confident that in most cases, and almost certainly in your case, you don't need other material. It's not that you shouldn't study other material. I don't care if you do. But you can take the Amber book and then take all 6 exams or whatever exams you have left. And then hopefully you'll pass most of them. And then if you fail a couple exams, then you can, start looking at other material if you want. But I think your best bet, your shortest path to licensure, your surest path to licensure is take the Amber book and take all 6 exams or whatever exams you have left. And people tell us this all the time. I just got an email today. Let me see if I can pull it up. I just got an email today. Well, anyhow, I'm not going to pull it up right now, but I just got an email. I got 2 emails in the last 2 days from people, just unsolicited, who just wrote and said, "I'm so glad I took them all at once. I did it all with the Amber book." Oh, and I got a text today too. That I can definitely pull up quickly. I got a text today from we have chapter licenses for AIA chapters, and AIA Virginia bought a chapter license, so they're giving Amber book to their people. And he wrote, I just got my 2nd email from Amber book participant that went 6 for 6, now licensed. So he's gotten 2 people writing him back, and they went 6 for 6, both of them. So can't guarantee that'll happen for everyone, but we have a really, really good record. Very proud of this product. All right, number 2, is there an Amber book Facebook group? Yes, there is, the Amber book. It's not really, it doesn't have that much stuff on it yet, but man, there's about to be. We are setting it up for all kinds of stuff. So very soon, so you can just follow us on Facebook now and get ready for all kinds of good stuff. What is the origin of the Amber book name? Could it be integrated into the sign-off phase? Maybe. Then there were additional sign-off suggestions. 1 week closer to shine. I don't know if I can get away with that one. Until next time, because we got you, honey. I definitely don't think I can sound authentic saying that. But what's the origin of the Amber book name? I'm not going to tell you. Not because I want to be mysterious, but because it's actually kind of a boring story. It's it's not about some kind of old lover. It's not a story about a gemstone. It's nothing like that. It's actually a pretty boring story. And so maybe I'll tell you some other time when we have more time to kill. So I'm going to go ahead and and then, so if you haven't already, you'll want to take a phone photo of this. Of course, we'll send this to you if you're on our mailing list. All right. Well, then we'll go ahead and we'll sign off tonight. Good night and get licensed.